So yeah, as Adrian said, this is really sort of the other part of work that makes up the Sustainable Seafood Guide, which is really working through the entire supply chain. There's a quote here which we can all read, and I don't think I need to actually spell it out for us, but it's pretty representative of the reason why, well, for one, why I'm here, but also for why we're working with restaurants specifically to do that work. So that's a quote that's from a fairly famous chef running what is for a number of years the best restaurant in the world, who done incredible things for the food industry globally. And it's something that these two guys, who are now good mates of mine, who run a restaurant out in Beaconsfield called Oh My, put on their wall in their little back garden. And they use it as a bit of a mantra for how they make business decisions, make life choices, or whatever that might be. And I get, in some ways, it's very similar to how I ended up here as well. I mean, I was one of those two guys there. I was a chef not too long ago, and then I used a very similar phrase and jumped into a master's in environmental sustainability and decided to work for a conservation organization. So, but that all comes back to the fact that, this work that we're doing needs to be done, and it's incredibly important. And restaurants have an incredibly important role in doing this work because they speak to the consumer every day. They're highly influential. So, Good Fish itself, the program is, all that science is sort of on the back end of it, but at the front end, it's a communications tool. It's a knowledge transfer tool and a communications tool. So we use all of that science, and we sort of help the food industry make choices, make better decisions, so that they can become advocates for us, for all of their customers. To give you a bit of an idea, I guess, of why it's so important to do that education part of that, though, is there's a couple of pictures here that sort of indicate the massive range that exists within the food industry around, I guess, how educated the food industry might be, or where their value sets might lie, or whatever that might be. On the one hand, you've got some chefs over in some Michelin-starred chefs in the United States and San Francisco, led by a brilliant woman named Dominique Crenn, who are doing phenomenal things for climate change and all the other things like that. And then you have a banner like this down from around a little place down by St Kilda, spruiking penguin platters and all of the seafood that we really probably shouldn't be eating, and advertising that as something that we should be essentially gorging ourselves on. So I guess it gives you a bit of indication that there's a wide range of people working in the food industry, and they all have different value sets and understandings. And so our work is really in order to sort of help people, really understand that these problems do exist, but do it in a way that works with them, holds their hand through it, and doesn't shove it down their throat, and it takes a bit more of a positive spin on it, I suppose. I might just very quickly. So, I mean, some of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, so it really falls into working with food, I guess, in the way that I know how to work with food, cooking it, talking about it, and working with other people that sort of engage with that industry in the same way. So I ran an event not long ago out in Gippsland with an amazing chef called Trevor Perkins at a restaurant called Hoggett Kitchen, and we cooked about 6 or 7 courses for his 100 guests of purely sustainable seafood from a local fishery here in Victoria, and took the opportunity to not just feed people, but talk to people about the things that we were feeding them while they were eating it. And so you end up in this sort of space where you have this perfectly captured audience that are enjoying themselves, having a really positive experience, but then also learning about the things in a really direct and tactile way. And so you're changing what can be a fairly ugly space, as you've sort of seen in some of the stuff that Leo has probably spoken about, and Adrian's definitely just spoken about, to something that can be a little bit more digestible and a little bit more sexy, I suppose. So, there's another few pictures there of an event I ran for Melbourne Knowledge Week last year that was based around serving the kinds of things that people might not necessarily always eat. So some urchins there you can see, which I created a beautiful sort of potato and urchin foam out of, and gave some people some potato chips to just eat that foam with. So, like, and I guess urchin is one of the, there's probably a great story that Adrian's better off to tell about urchins, about, the sustainability of eating urchins. In fact, there's something that's actually causing quite a lot of environmental harm. And so these species do exist that we can happily eat if we're aware of their role that they play in the ecosystem. And I suppose that's part of the messaging that we're trying to work with through the program that I'm running. Then, of course, there's some of the risks in doing this work as well. There's an event that I ran last year with Attica and a restaurant called Harvest in Byron Bay. I'll try and play this little clip, but it's probably not going to work. Which is really interesting because this was sort of our first big event, big media storm around what we were doing and all of these sorts of things. And so you can see, and so we posted this fish that we ordered specifically for the event. Ben Shuri from Attica, who's quite a well-known chef, who's also our ambassador, was specific that he only wanted to serve green listed species because he's now our ambassador. He wants to be sure that he's not doing anything wrong. And so he spoke with his fish supplier and bought these beautiful snappers here that were supposed to be sold, were supposed to be caught out of Port Phillip Bay, one of the sort of really our only sustainable pink snapper fishery in the country. And so, here we were all proud with our snapper from the sustainable fishery, took a picture of it, put it on Instagram, and probably not 15, 20 minutes later, the internet blows up with people that are way more knowledgeable about the biology of a snapper, telling us that that wasn't in fact a Port Phillip Bay snapper. That was a snapper from New Zealand, which is an incredibly overfished fishery. So it sort of alludes to this issue. It's quite significant in seafood supply chains, and whether it's negligence or ignorance or whatever it is that fuels it, there's a lot of cases of what is essentially fish fraud or mislabeling of species, and we were caught out. But I look back on that and I go, that's kind of great to be caught out in a really public space, working with people that are so noble about what they're trying to achieve. And so we spoke about it like that. And we traced back through the supply chain, found out where the problem went wrong. And we were therefore able to inform everybody that was involved in that of the issue. And it turns out, at least, from what we believe in that instance, that it was more ignorance, sort of ignorance than sort of negligence or anything sort of a little bit more nasty than that. But it speaks to what is an incredibly big issue. And you can see there that not long ago, I think that was about a year ago now, some students in Sydney did a sample of seafood being sold at the Sydney fish market and found that 10% of it was mislabeled. So, you don't actually necessarily know that when you're buying your pink snapper that it is actually pink snapper, or whatever other species you might be buying. It might not actually be that thing. And I'm sure Leo spoke earlier about the issues around alternative species ending up within the supply chain. And now these issues get bigger as you sort of go in other markets and other supply chains. There's some studies suggesting that number can increase to between 30 and 50% of fish in certain parts of the world are mislabeled, either intentionally or not. So, we're doing a little bit of work there moving forward. We've partnered with a company that's using blockchain to secure supply chains to sort of counter this issue. And I guess if I step back a little bit and talk about why that's a problem, if you think about it really practically as a consumer, and you'll say, look at our app, you go, hey, I want to buy this green listed species because I know nothing is going wrong in that supply chain, and I know that species is helpful and its environment, it's healthy, and that its environment is healthy. So you've done your research, you've done your bit, you're making the right consumer choice. You go to the fish market, you buy something, it's not what it's supposed to be, and instead you're buying something that is coming from a horrific, ecologically damaging environment. And now so therefore everything that you think you're doing right is completely undermined by the fact that something in the supply chain isn't working. Incredibly complicated thing to work on, but as I say, there's some companies now, like the one which we've just struck a partnership with, that are using great technology like blockchain to try and tackle that. So it's a space where we're starting to focus a little bit more on. So where are we sort of now? That's our fisheries team there. To the left, you've got Tuni Mato, myself, Ben Shuri, our ambassador, Adrian and Leo, who spoke earlier. Um, we've worked now with 92 businesses around the country who have all committed to our program, essentially meaning that those 92 businesses in Australia have committed to no longer serving red listed or unsustainable fish. So that means that you as a consumer can go into their restaurant or food business and be 100% certain that what you're buying and what they're serving is exactly what they say it is, for one, as much as possible, and also that it's not doing any damage to the ecosystem. So that's something that we've built over a couple of years now, and it definitely hasn't been easy because there's a lot of alternative voices and perspectives in this world, and a lot of experts that might have another sort of motive for telling information that telling people information that might be sort of contrary to what we might say. And so and I mean, the other part of it, I suppose, is that it's quite hard to make this shift for restaurants. If you consider that some restaurants might serve 10, 15 species of fish, 30 to 50% of those might be something that they can no longer use if they sign up to our program. So that means that they need to change it the way that they order, for one, that they need to educate themselves on how to use other species. They need to educate the consumer that the consumer can't eat the species that they would have traditionally wanted to eat. So, all of these things have flow-on effects. And when you're working in an industry that really bases itself around giving, allowing people to have a good time and supporting people to have a good time, you really don't want to put any friction into these relationships. You don't want to, have an argument at the table about why they can't eat the fish that they might have traditionally wanted to eat. So it means that these restaurants and food businesses and chefs really have to put their values before their businesses and let their values drive their businesses. And not everybody isn't necessarily ready to do that straight away. So it's a fairly manual task to getting manual and sort of long task to getting as far as we have, I suppose, on that one. Now this clip is definitely not going to work either, which is a real shame because it speaks to Ben Shuri, our ambassador, and sort of the incredible work that he's done and sort of his incredible value set. But so we'll skip right across towards, I suppose, the crux of using restaurants and the crux of talking about this stuff in a really positive manner. So, if you sort of think that the majority of the food industry itself is really not that well versed on these issues. I mean, I certainly wasn't as a chef a couple of years ago. One of the stories I tell all the time is that, I could always be entirely sure that, when I pick up the phone and call my pig farmer, that, I knew exactly what was happening on that property. I knew exactly how they were treating the land. I knew exactly what was happening in that supply chain. And the same thing with my vegetable farmer. I knew exactly that, I knew they were biodynamic. I knew exactly what went into that soil. They would tell me. It was complete transparency because I had that relationship. That doesn't exist in the seafood chain. So, if you're a chef, you pick up the phone and you call a wholesaler. That wholesaler has then bought their fish from a wholesale market, and that wholesale market is bought potentially from a distributor or a fishing company or another middleman that is then taken from a fishing boat that's somewhere deep offshore or even worse, international. So, it's very hard and for no fault of anyone's own to actually know the detail of what's happening in all of those different parts. So if the restaurant doesn't know, then the public really doesn't have any chance to know. And so we've done all this work at the restaurant level, and also, as you can see through some of these articles, through the media, around trying to introduce people to fish in a way, and the problems with fish in a way that's a little bit more digestible than shouting about how nasty things are, or how things are being overfished, or how to some of the work that Adrian's spoken about before. Not everybody has the appetite for that. Some people don't want to know, they just want to know that it's okay. And so something like what you see there around the Gourmet Traveler articles that went out, that's just a series of beautiful recipes that are made with sustainable species. So someone can just go, cool, that sounds delicious, I want to eat that. And then they're just comforted by the fact that they're not doing anything wrong. It's a far less sort of invasive way, I suppose, of putting the issue across. And then there's sort of, I guess, a really concrete example that I guess I can give you around how our work has engaged the restaurant industry and chefs, fishery, the whole fishing industry, and conservation groups like ourselves to come together to a fairly, really to a fairly positive outcome. And so that example is the Corner Inlet fishery that I mentioned earlier, which you can see there's an article about here. Access to prized Victorian seafood under threat, say fishers. This is a really interesting example where these fishermen have sort of, some of them are fourth or fifth generation fishermen. And over that time, they've taken the lead of their own environment to put in a voluntary code of conduct that essentially protects their environment over the economics of that fishery. So limits the amount that they fish, for instance, limits the time that they fish and things like that. And so we, since sort of mid last year, have been working really closely with both them and the food industry here in Victoria to build market demand and awareness of the great work that that fishery is doing. In November last year, I brought 15, it might have been 16 or 17 of the leading chefs in Victoria down to Corner Inlet and took them fishing with the fishermen. And so sounds like a really simple thing to do, but 14 out of those 17 chefs had never been fishing before on a commercial fishing boat. Most of them had never spoken to a fisherman. And likewise, most of these fishers had never spoken to chefs. So, and this is only 3 hours away from Melbourne. So, it's hardly a long way away, but those relationships never existed before for people to really understand each other's issues. So, part of bringing people down here was about, I guess, quite literally breaking bread. The picture there on the left is a picture of about 40 individuals, chefs and fishermen who, prior to being here, had never really spoken to one another. But we as chefs cooked the seafood that the fishermen had caught that morning for them and put lunch on. And suddenly, if you looked around that room that day, it was as though these two worlds were just colliding, and these people were best friends, and they had so much in common, so many struggles that they shared. And it was like sort of like these worlds, were naturally designed to be together because they naturally are. They both love nature typically, they both love fish, they love food. These people are so much alike, and yet they never talk to each other. So this is sort of, I guess, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about positive advocacy. It's about bringing people together around the issues, but bring them together in a way that doesn't necessarily raise conflict. It allows people to sort of literally break bread and sort of work through these things in a more positive way. And as a result, we now have a food industry here in Victoria which asks for Corner Inlet fish by name, and will only, a number of them who will only serve Corner Inlet fish because these relationships exist. The outcome of doing all of this is something that happened only about a month ago. The picture there on the right is Fisherman, Minister Yala Pulford, our Minister for Fisheries, the board director of Seafood Industry Victoria. You've got conservationists in the mix. You've got recreational fishing representatives who have all not necessarily always gotten along. However, on the issue of a long-term economically and environmentally sustainable fishery that now has a strong market, they managed to find common ground. And so we had these rules and regulations that were once voluntarily maintained by only a majority of these fishermen put into regulation, led by fishermen, which is a fairly sort of unique way of approaching these, a unique way to sort of get there. And I thought I might let Adrian sort of talk a little bit, I suppose, about why that is so significant and what that means for the ecology of Corner Inlet.
Yeah, well, it might seem a little bit weird that people like us from the Marine Conservation Society would be saying that fishermen are champions of the environment and that we would actually work to try and keep them on the water fishing. It might seem a bit counterintuitive, but these guys are amazing. They have spent a lot of time doing things like working out how to and getting involved with replanting the seagrass, which covers the corner inlet area and is fundamental to the survival of their fishery and the whole ecosystem. They've been working with farmers to help encourage them to reduce pollution, which is coming off the farms from fertilizer and runoff, and which is also impacting that seagrass. And they've been working to deal with an invasion of sea urchins, which arrived in Corner Inlet waters as a result of climate change pushing these really unusually warm currents that the sea urchins could ride down the coast into. They also fish with these nets that are really hard to use, but what they do, as well as having a really light touch on that seagrass, is they don't actually entangle the fish they catch. They essentially corral them and they bring them into the side of the boat in a sort of fenced in, I suppose, and then they literally go in with like a dip net and scoop out the fish they want for the day, the fish they can sell, the fish of the right size and species, and they can let everything else go. And essentially the worst that happens to a fish that gets caught in that net that they don't want to keep is that it loses a few hours of its day getting trapped in that sort of ring of net that you can see there, but is otherwise unharmed. And we really need to encourage that. Now, what these guys wanted to do with their rule change was the rule was about putting out any more than 2 of these nets in any day was the crux of it. And because that fishery doesn't have a lot of really complicated, really detailed science to support the management, they just take a much simpler approach and say, if we know that if we don't fish much, then our fish stocks will stay healthy the way they have for the last 50 years or so. So let's just keep it that way. And, if we're doing less fishing and keeping our catches up, then that's a good thing. So they could go out and catch a lot more fish, but they don't want to because they'd much rather have confidence that they'll still be able to catch those fish in years to come. So supporting them to keep their fishery, to stay on the water, and to implement these really basic but really environmentally careful rules is just a really wonderful thing to do, and yeah, super rewarding for us, and just great for them too. So really exciting. And as you can see from Sascha and I have been talking, his work is very much the friendly, positive end, whereas my work that I've described is something that's a lot more confrontational and requires arguments and clashes of heads. And so it's amazing to be able to do this and drive this positive change as well. Back to you, Sascha.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much carrot and stick approach, right? Like it's really simple. And what that has done, I mean, there's a couple of things in that, to the corner inlet example. Every fish that's bought by a chef from Corner Inlet and not from a damaging fishery somewhere else is a really good thing, because we know that there's some certainty around what's happening down in Corner Inlet, whereas we have no idea or what we do, but we're shifting market demand essentially. And so that's one good result. The second one is that by working with fishermen and working with the fishing industry and things like that, we're building bridges with sectors of the community that may not necessarily have always had a particularly warm approach to conservationists or environmentalists, because it's pretty common for environmentalists and conservationists to get thrown into a bucket of people that are very challenging to work with, and only want to have fights, and want to limit economic growth and all of these things that people like. But the reality is that we want all of those things, but we just don't want to sacrifice the environment for it. And I guess our belief is that a strong, healthy environment is what will actually fuel a really healthy fishery. And it's quite simple. It's a little bit of a change of I guess, perspective from maybe what the norm is, or maybe those lines are a bit blurred sometimes. But I suppose that's what underpins the work that I'm doing. That was pretty much most of what I had to say. I suppose, just thinking, in one more point to the idea of positive messaging, I suppose, is that, right now, what we've just been through, things like COVID, or all of the things that are just happening right now at the world, like, people are pretty exhausted about hearing bad stories, right? Like, you read the Guardian, or you read the headlines most days, and it's pretty much rubbish. Like, it's, you pretty you pretty much just want to go straight back to bed. So by using these other means to get through to people, you tend to find your message is A, accepted, and B, people will talk to you again. So there's kind of like, it's a different approach, but I think, both have their place at their time. For instance, it's not our, we're definitely not going to turn around and have a really friendly conversation about orange roughy any particular time soon. But you need to sort of, pick and choose your approach, I suppose. So if there's any questions, more than happy. But Peter, I don't know if you wanted to step in and facilitate that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, guys. I was so enthralled the whole time. I was sitting here. I was actually Googling Attica while I was sitting here. Amazing. It was so good to hear some of the work that's being done, especially around the Corner Inlet. If only those fishing practices could be copied everywhere else, that would be amazing. I do have just a couple of questions before we wrap up for the day, though, and a few I'm thinking maybe some of the kids were wondering as well. Adrian, you were speaking about all the rulings, and especially we were mentioning the orange roughy. Who is making that sustainable? Who is going, yep, that's a green fish, that's one we can eat, even though it's, still got all these issues surrounding it?
Well, it's money. It's money, right? And the money goes back to the guys that own the fishing boats, and they want to get a top price for their nasty fish. So if they can put enough money in the right place, they can find someone to say, and to maybe put aside some of the science that we have and have a look at some other stuff that may not have anything to do with orange roughy fishing, but makes it sound a bit nicer, and then try and put it out there and see if it floats. It's probably worth a shot from their point of view, if money is the thing they want. And if you want to be an orange roughy fisherman, you're probably not doing it out of a deep sense of connection to the ocean. So yeah, and it's our job. So we don't have money at the Australian Marine Conservation Society, but we do have an incredible network of supporters and trust in the community. So we have to be very careful with that. It's a very powerful thing to be able to use, so, and an amazing privilege as well. So that's how that works.
So Adrian, if you were saying to us, all right, you want to go food shopping, what would be the best way for us to choose what fish we want to eat? Is there something else we can use other than some of the guides that are around, or should we just go with the Good Fish Guide?
Well, the Good Fish Guide for Australians is, it's the one to use. It's the one that doesn't have, there's no, we don't get any money from the fishing industry to tell you, to influence whether we tell you something's good or bad. Yeah. So we don't have a reasonable motivation to tell you anything than our take on it. It is, of course, our take on it, and we might get it wrong from time to time, but we fix it when we do. But have a little think before you go to the shop about what you might like, and then have a look at our guide. And when you get there, if they don't have anything like it, well, ask for it, because if the fishmonger hears it, he'll go, okay, yeah, all right, people are asking for that one. I'll see if I can get some in. And then next time you might see there's a couple of great choices, and then eventually there'll be a few. I was delighted to go to my local fishmonger the other day. I do a lot of my own fishing. I don't buy much these days. To see that he had the only kind of farmed salmon that we recommend, which is actually from New Zealand and not the Tasmanian stuff, because there's some serious environmental issues down there.
Mm.
And, you know, it was great. I had all this choice. And it was because of people like me being thoughtful about their seafood and saying, you know, I want this. Can you get it? And eventually it makes sense too. And he loves the stuff and sells a lot of it. So everyone's happy. And that's a cool way to be part of that change.
Perfect. So download the app, everyone. Now, Tiana, there's a question there from Mia.
Yeah, Mia's got a really good question. Kind of two parts to it. Do fisheries face any consequences when they aren't sustainable, or do they get away with it? And are there any laws against non-sustainable fisheries?
Yeah, look, so in principle, there's a whole lot of laws, and Australia's really well served with them relative to some other places. But they're not necessarily that well applied. And that's partly because the main thing to do when you're trying to manage the ocean, the first thing you've got to acknowledge is how little we understand about how it works. Like, I can think of some of my favourite sharks, which Leo does a lot of great work on, the sawfish, incredible creatures. We don't know how many there are. We don't know really where they live and where they go. So without knowing that, we have no idea of whether it's, you know, how many can be killed without it being a serious threat to their existence. So we should probably have as few as possible. And so there's laws that say, you know, there's a regulation which means you have to fish for sawfish in a way so that their populations can recover. But it's like, recover from what and recover to where? So the laws are there, but they're definitely not enough. And look, there's a lot of Australian seafood now that, say, our supermarkets won't stock. And so that means they can't sell them, not for a good price anyway. And that is because the masses of Australians have demanded that their seafood comes from you know, relatively good fisheries. And while there's still work to be done, that is the sort of effective punishment, if you like, and that's kind of what we're working towards with our restaurant program, and in a positive way to drive that change too.
Amazing. Now, to finish off, Sascha, a question for you. We know all the good work that's being done, and we know the amazing scientists like Adrian that are getting out there and getting the data for us. And then you mentioned the 93, 92 restaurants that are getting involved. How did you get the word out there? I know a lot of us have voices and there's a lot we want to say, but how did you get the media coverage to get this concept out there? I know we hear a lot about Indigenous food at the moment. We hear a lot about it, paddock to plate, and now it feels like this is the next step with this sustainable seafood.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a good question, and I don't think I have a good answer for it, because the reality is that nobody controls the media, and you can't tell the media what to do. But if you give them a compelling enough story, then they're going to run it. So I think when we first went to the media, we had Ben Shuri, who at the time, his restaurant was on the world's 50 best list at something like 53 or maybe even 26 at the time. So really well-known guy, had committed to doing the work with us and being our ambassador. And I think at the time we also had 20 other venues. So we went to the media and said, look, these people are really concerned about these things and they're no longer going to serve unsustainable seafood. We really think it's important. And so the media was interested in that. Because again, to go back to where I spoke about a little bit earlier, the reason we're working with chefs is because they have influence. You know, MasterChef is the perfect example of that. The fact that we will sit down most nights of the week and watch people run around cooking cooking sort of fake food in a fake environment is a really bizarre thing. But it's, you know, and it's that voice that we're harnessing through the program, at least with the restaurants. The other supply chain stuff is less fascinating, but you know, there's I think people are becoming aware, and it's definitely become easier over the last couple of years. Definitely the conversations I'm having now are less aggressive and far more supportive in a general sense. And that's across sectors. So, you know, I think people are starting to become more aware, and I think that has a little bit to do with what we do, but also a lot to do with something I mentioned before, which is people are really sick of all the bad stuff that's going on.
Yeah. Positive messaging all the way, I think, at the moment, like you said, talking about the good, not the bad, and sharing those good stories. And it is just becoming more mainstream and cooler to do right by the environment. So we're actually all involved at a really awesome time for the world, I think.
Yeah, and thankfully our younger generation are really driving that at the moment, which is awesome.
That's
awesome.
good.
Yeah, that's you guys. You're in charge now. No, not really. Well, we might leave it there, guys, but we want to say huge thank you. And I hope you don't mind if we share some of your info and things with the Ocean Youth Ambassadors. And if we've got any more questions, to forward them on to you after this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Adrian. Go enjoy your surf. And thank you, Sascha. We will be in touch. Don't worry. We're all down here in Melbourne together. And to all of you guys at Ocean Youth, we will talk to you after this as well. But we have one last webinar next Saturday morning at 10 a.m. with Yarra River Keepers and Wing Chan talking about coral restoration from Monash University. So on behalf of all of us, thanks, Sascha. Thanks, Adrian. And thank you to the AMCS. And we'll be chatting to you all shortly, and we will see you all next week.
Hey, thank you so much, guys. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Well
guys.
done.
Thank you.
See ya.